Okay, everyone, thank you so much for your patience, and thank you for sticking around for the whole day of panels we've got. This is the last panel of the day, and it is on biotechnology, and we're very excited to have our panelists here. As you can see, a really diverse group of people from across the School of Medicine, the Berman Institute of Bioethics, as well as the School of Engineering. So we have a lot of different expertise on the stage, and we're really looking forward to this conversation. The panel will be moderated by Deborah Matthews. She is the Associate Director for Research and Programs at the Johns Hopkins Berman Institute of Bioethics. She's also a professor in the Department of Genetic Medicine at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. And Deborah will introduce the other panelists, so take it away, Deborah.
Can you all hear me? The few, the proud, the final panel. Thank you very much for being here. So, as with the other panels that we've heard today, biotechnology is a field where you have rapidly evolving technology, you have lots of risks and benefits, some known, some unknown, to contend with. You have gnarly governance problems. Plus, you have human health and fundamental questions of human meaning, right? Like questions about free will, about modifying the human genome, about the moral status of human embryos. And we have a great panel to talk about these issues and more. We have a group, as Olga was saying, scientists, technologists, ethics and governance scholars who work on just these kinds of issues. So I am not going to go in seat order, but we have Nitish Thakur. He's professor of biomedical engineering and neurology at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine and is a neurotechnologist. Greg Newby, assistant professor of genetic medicine also at the School of Medicine. He's been at the forefront of CRISPR and genome editing technology since his training. Jeremiah Salam is assistant professor in biomedical engineering at the Whiting School of Engineering and uses AI to address biomedical problems. And finally, Jeffrey Kahn is the Andreas C. Dracopoulos Director of the Johns Hopkins Berman Institute of Bioethics, where I also live, professor in the Department of Health Policy and Management at the Bloomberg School of Public Health, and works at the intersection of ethics and health and science policy. And now finally, Adler Archer is the inaugural director of the Office of Strategy Management at the Whiting School of Engineering, associate research scientist in the Department of Biomedical Engineering with a joint appointment at the School of Medicine. And he works on digital health innovation, community-based participatory research, and social informatics. So we are going to start with Nitish, actually. So can you tell us a bit about the work that you do on neuroprosthetics and brain injury and some of the sort of ethics and governance challenges that you foresee in that space?
So when you go to Johns Hopkins, some website or Google any video, one of the ones you will see is brain-controlled prosthetics developed across the university, including applied physics lab, right? So that is the field of brain-machine interface. That's one thing. That's neurotechnology. It got a little extra oomph because of Neuralink and Elon Musk invested in it in a big way, but it's a significant and large field. In fact, we were here about a week ago with Adler hosting a conference on Neurotechnology Hub. So that is one of the things. On the other hand, people are getting old. We recognize a lot of brain diseases and disorders. And so brain disease and health is a big thing. So again, can a technology play a role? So those are the kind of things that I work with. However, I don't think I'm here to describe the technology, but rather broader ramifications. So are you going to ask me a question, or should I be a little bit, give my own
Yeah, well, we talked a little bit previously about the two case studies around the neuroprosthesis.
Yeah, so can I get up? I mean, I think it's two-step. Okay, let me engage you, right? So I want to kind of give you a choice, okay? For $1 million, you can get a brain surgery, implant chips in your brain, so that by your thought, you can control a dexterous prosthetic hand. Choice number one, multiple choice question. Choice number two, I have spun off a company that makes $50,000 with total cost adding up a little bit more, FDA-approved device that uses your muscles, you wear it, you go home, you can use that prosthetic hand. Choice number three, I'm from India, and I spoke with my student who is trying to do that in India and said, well, you know, they want it for like 10,000 rupees, so which is about $100. I think there's significantly more amputees there or in other parts of the world. Okay, multiple choice question. Choice A, how many want to get brain surgery and $1 million prosthetic hand? Choice two, $100, $1,000, you know, $50,000, $100,000, gee whiz, it works. FDA will reimburse it. There's some hands. Please participate. And we are here at SAIS, Advanced International Studies. So international is the norm. I mean, do we want to make, if 100 is too much, $1,000 for the rest of the world? Who wants to invest in that? A few hands. So that's what it's here, right? We are in Washington, and our government has invested something like $100 million over 20 years on brain-controlled prosthetics, and Neuralink is probably investing as much to bring it to the patient for whatever their objective. And we're not investing anything fractional to a simple 3D printed hand for $100 that a kid loses the limb in any part of the world, including here. So is it ethical? Is it economical? Is it a good business? What are we doing? So if we have more time, we can debate that question. And may I just leave it at that and go to part two, because you need to manage my time. Because, you know, I'm going to provoke you. There are other factors, like, of course, you're asking me about, Nitish, what do you do? Well, I can control the hand. I did it many years ago. But what about the feeling? So, hello, this is my robotic hand. So do I feel that you are warm and friendly? And how do you get the feeling back? So that is what National Institute of Health in research will fund us, or DARPA might be interested in. So I think we have this strategic choices to make. Are we investing it the right way? Are our ethical decision, brain surgery, is it appropriate so that I can play a game with my mind? Is that thought? Okay, so part A, but you can follow up and then I'll go to part B.
I mean, you're raising fundamental questions about the innovation ecosystem and what it's targeted toward, right? Like, what are the questions that we're pointing all of this money and effort at, and who is it serving? I mean, those are exactly the kinds of questions that I think we definitely want to address, and that a lot of the panels have addressed today as well.
And I think it'll come down to, we as a society say, well, let's invest in DARPA with X billion so that we push the envelope as far as it gets, and that's one appropriate, but we could also have USAID say, let's make $100 3D printed hand for any kid, and it grows with the kid over the lifetime, and they'll need the limb. And somewhere in between, my colleague here, Andrew raised hand, he's an electrical engineer, so he'll take $50,000, $100,000. Seems like something FDA would approve, and a startup in US will be able to fund it. So we have 3 different ecosystems. So in the interest of time, I'm going to switch gears. But do follow up with question, because I think it's important that Neuralink, spending hundreds of millions to put a chip in the brain to control, so that what do you play games and Twitter with it, or are we helping amputee with that? So I kind of wonder what that is. Okay, part B. So I want to kind of tell you a very, very brief story. A colleague of mine on my floor in School of Medicine is 50-something, very, very good scientist, doing actually cardiovascular sort of basic science research. I came into the School of Medicine early in the morning, and my student says, do you know that Dr. Yu kind of collapsed, and I think they've taken him to emergency room. I said, look, what happened? I kind of inquired. Anyway, because we don't have time, so long story short, first thing in the morning, I think he had cardiac arrest, as best as we can tell. I think they probably did CPR, and eventually didn't survive. So we have few hundred, few thousand amputees. Do you know how many people get sudden cardiac death? That's what I described right now. Something between 300 to 400,000 people in the United States get sudden cardiac death. That means you're good one moment and you're not. Any of you remember that vividly while watching TV, something that you do on Sunday, that incident occur? The football player who got hit on the chest, arrested, etc. Okay, part A. Part B. How many of you been through the airport and noticed a box sitting out there with some medical sign with something that you should use? I see one hand there, a few more hands. I'm really, this is impressive, how many hands I'm seeing. So what is that box, Andreas? A defibrillator. Or defibrillator is the shock device. So you have about 4 minutes to get that defibrillator to you. My colleague needed that defibrillator in 4 minutes to give a shock so that we resuscitated. So statistically, several of us are candidates for that. And I mean, is there a defibrillator in SAIS? Do you know where it is? Thank you. Now, are people aware and educated? How many of you know how to do CPR? So, incredible. Okay, so now let's get to, because I don't want to take too much time. So here it is, 300 to 400,000. We are all excellent candidates, including young people who are athletes and some of us senior citizens here. What are we investing in it? So through a paradigm shift, a defibrillator got placed everywhere else. If we can educate people to use it, but the brain gets damaged, and so success rate of survival is 10%, and brain recovery of some sort is about 2%. So that is my NIH grant, is basic science of recovering and surviving brain. I think government is investing in an important problem. I think it's a virtuous system because companies have invested in defibrillators. Society has invested in placing them all over the building and everywhere else. You are all aware of it. So what I'm saying is that I think here, why we are here, or why you should be listening to me, is that can we create this virtuous ecosystem? The science of, in fact, implantable defibrillator, not just the defibrillator was invented at Johns Hopkins. The CPR, the whole science of CPR was developed at Johns Hopkins. So with all of that, first dean of engineering, for example, who was instrumental. And we created a virtuous ecosystem over decades. So cardiac intensive care, pacemaker defibrillator, excellent CPR training. But we still have very large number of people dying and very few survival. So what we should be, you should be asking to your congressperson or your university or asking NIH, where does the investment go? And what's important in this regard? I don't know how I'm doing on time, but unless you want to follow up, if I'm over, I'm very conscious of being over time. Otherwise, I can continue a little bit. So you'll decide.
I greatly appreciate that. But since we got started a little bit late, why don't we turn, you get to keep that. Yeah.
Thank you for listening. And CPR, know where the defibrillator is, please, for your family member and friends and colleagues' sake.
And keep in mind that question, your last question, which was, what do we invest in, and how do we make those decisions? So because biotechnology is actually quite a broad space, we now have something completely different. So now, Greg, I'm going to turn to you. As I mentioned before, you've been sort of pushing the boundaries of the CRISPR technology, of genome editing technologies since your postdoc, and now continuing on faculty at Hopkins. And we were chatting a little bit about this out in by the refreshments earlier. But can you talk about a bit about your work and what it's capable of currently, and the kind of ethics and governance questions that you've been thinking about, particularly recently?
Yeah, thank you, Deborah. This is working, I think. Yep. Yeah, good. Well, I guess just to start with, I wanted to highlight the scale of the problem that we're trying to deal with now in the lab, and use as an example the War of the Worlds. I don't know if you've seen the movie or read the book. If you haven't, you might want to cover your ears because I'll spoil. Oh, yeah, that's true. Or listen to the radio program. You might want to cover your ears because I'll spoil the ending. Towards the end of the movie, the aliens conquer humanity. They overcome our defenses with their superior firepower, but they're all themselves destroyed by the microbes that have already colonized the Earth. And the narrator in the movie comments that by the toll of 1 billion deaths, humankind has earned their immunity and right to survive among this planet's infinite organisms. And so this is because of the variations in our genomes that allow us to adapt to survive in the face of different pathogenic insults or environmental challenges that we face. And certainly, humanity has been able to survive because of this ability. But in addition to those deaths that we suffer at the hands of microbes, this ability comes with a real cost. So over 1 in 50 newborns inherit a genetic disorder that decreases their quality of life or hastens their death. And from the dawn of humankind until right now, there's been little to nothing that we could do about that problem. We could maybe ease their pain a little bit. But just in the last decade, there have been amazing advances, and now we even have the ability to rewrite our own genomes. 2 weeks ago, the first genome editing therapeutic ever in the world was approved in the UK for the treatment of sickle cell disease. And here in the USA, on December 8th, we anticipate hearing from the FDA about the same treatment. And this, I think, marks an incredible achievement by humanity because the sickle cell mutation is probably the single letter in our DNA that's caused the most suffering in humankind. However, the medicine that fixes that defect is really only applicable to 10% of those 1 in 50 children that are born every year with genetic disease. Most of the genetic diseases that we suffer from aren't like sickle cell disease at all. They don't have one single nucleotide that every patient inherits. Instead, they have hundreds or even thousands of different mutations that cause them. And at the same time, even the strategy that we have right now for gene correction or genome editing to treat sickle cell disease leaves much to be desired. So my research involves trying to make safer, cheaper, and more accessible genome editing treatments for sickle cell disease, and also adapting the latest cutting-edge genome editing tools to other genetic diseases like blindness, cystic fibrosis, and heart disease. And after this most recent success with sickle cell disease, I expect there's now going to be a huge wave of new therapeutics where we're taking advantage of this new ability and correcting misspellings in our DNA and saving people's lives. This advancement I don't think we could have made without any interdisciplinary collaboration, because the tools we use to edit genomes were taken from those same microorganisms that guard our planet against the Martians. It's only because of the collaborations between the microbiologists, the molecular engineers, that we first gained the ability to edit genomes. And now with collaborations with companies, doctors, regulatory agencies, we're actually able to finalize the form that these medicines can take before they're injected into people. I think that future great innovations are going to enable adaptation of this technology to more genetic diseases, simplify the process of bringing this technology to all parts of the world, and be able to now address eventually all of those 1 in 50 children that suffer. But even given that, I think there's a lot of scientific challenges that remain, as well as ethical, legal, and societal questions that we need to continue to discuss. So a few that I wanted to highlight now are, first, how we ensure equitable access for these expensive but life-changing therapeutics. The NIH has spent hundreds of millions of dollars in grants, and these federally funded grants enabled the basic technology, and then companies spent more than 100 million to actually apply these. So it's very expensive, but now the way that our system is set up, Americans with poor healthcare coverage aren't going to be able to benefit from these medicines at all because of their extreme cost. Furthermore, individuals that have different genetic backgrounds could respond differently to genome editing therapeutics, and they have different risks for off-target effects, the chance that they might have one variant that mimics the site that's being edited, and so this could lead to a nucleotide change, eventually causing cancer in that person. So we need to learn how we can best screen all of the patient populations, understand their risks, and appropriately apply these medicines. And in addition to that, there are guidelines right now specifying how we apply genome editing therapeutics, that they should be adapted first to the key areas of importance, that the greatest need, where people are suffering and dying. And I think that's absolutely true and important. But as the technology continues to progress, and in the coming decade, the coming 3 decades, it might be commonplace to edit your genome and fix a disease. We'll have the ability to install many other kinds of nucleotide changes. We might be able to install variants that make us stronger or have better memory, or lower our BMA. The BMI, sorry. But and in addition to that, thinking of how we can actually ethically regulate the access to those therapeutics, and not only in the context of self-modification, but modification of our germline and the later generations. So just 5 years ago, as you mentioned recently, just exactly 5 years ago, the first case of CRISPR babies was announced to the world, that a doctor had injected CRISPR genome-modifying enzymes into a human zygote or embryo, and the resulting children were born without the CCR5 receptor, so they were immune to HIV, perhaps more susceptible to other diseases. And this received broad condemnation, and that scientist that coordinated this went to jail because of this risk that now those children could harbor additional genetic variants that are in the human gene pool and can't be removed. And so, in the future, as this becomes possible, I'm curious to talk about those who are interfacing with AI, because that's also going to increase accessibility to all technologies. People might be able to ask their Alexa, how do I do this? Maybe it'll cost $10,000, $20,000, order their own kits and make their own genetic modifications to themselves or their offspring. So understanding how society is going to deal with that, I think, is another big challenge of the coming decades.
Yeah, and you raised, I think, a couple of different slices of that too, right? Like the CRISPR treatments that are for sick people who are sitting in front of you versus CRISPR modification of the next generation of people. Two sort of fundamentally different ways of approaching that technology. And again, how do we make decisions about that? And then you also added to Nitish's concerns about financial access, the questions of biological access, right? About whose genomes do we know enough that we can actually develop and deploy technologies like this safely? Yeah. So we're going to get one more technology on the table before we start grappling more with the ethics and governance side of things. And this is Jeremiah Salam. So, we've had an AI panel earlier, and in fact, AI has turned up on every single panel today. Definitely a theme of the day. But can you talk a bit about the intersection between the work you do on AI and in biomedicine specifically?
Sure, I'd love to. Thank you, Deborah, and it's first and foremost is really flattering for me to be here sharing the stage with such a distinguished set of researchers here at Hopkins and colleagues. So as you said, I work on data science problems, and broadly speaking, we try to understand how we can leverage data to make inference about the world, how we can potentially assist decision-making broadly, but also in the clinic and in the context of medicine. Now, because I care specifically about contexts that have to do with patients and human health, there are some set of issues that are very relevant that perhaps don't appear as often if you instead focus on problems that pertain predicting likelihood for ads on Amazon, for example. And the previous panel on AI touched on a bunch of those topics, and I want to revisit two that I think are particularly important when you talk about applications in the clinic. One of them has to do with notions of trustworthiness. And this is key because it touches on things that have to do with trust. It touches on things that pertain robustness. It touches on things that pertain auditing, and all of these components, all of these dimensions are really critical if we are to deploy these things at large and make them happen. Another very important problem that is particularly sensitive in these clinical applications is that of fairness. So before I go into a little bit more detail into those two problems, let me just say that I think the interesting thought on this regard is that I feel there is a disconnect between how these societal constraints of AI algorithms and data science problems are studied and regarded from people who study them from a purely or more technical perspective, say in academia, from how the public at large think of these issues and how people who care about policy and regulation understand them. And these gaps are crucial. We need to understand them better. We need to come together in a very much of an interdisciplinary way, much in the spirit of what we're doing here, really, to try to fill these gaps. So let me give you a couple of examples. When we say interpretability and trustworthiness, basically what we're trying to say is if I have an automatic system that is recommending things that I should decide upon, maybe it's a screening procedure for patients, for example. If I have an automatic method that is suggesting that this patient be admitted, for example, well, what kind of questions should I be able to probe the system about? If you ask the technical experts that develop these systems, they have ways of thinking about these problems. Even these ways among experts often do not agree. And the rise of this technology has been so sudden that there is, as the entire discourse in society is taking place, even within the academic world, people are still discussing what are the best ways of posing these questions. If we were perhaps on a more technical venue, I would be very happy to be, very vocal about what kind of things one should do and what you shouldn't do. But all of this is to say that there is still a lot of ongoing conversations between the technical experts as to what kind of things you could even hope to understand about how decisions are made. That should be contrasted, for example, with regulation efforts, for example, in Europe, where that we're very fast in putting out regulation, like the general data protection regulation, that basically went on to specify things to a level of degree, for example, regarding, I forget the specific language, but has something to do with the logical process in which the decisions are made, that is quite disconnected from the fact that even the academic community doesn't even come to an agreement as to how these things should be explained, let alone in a logical process. And so this leads to, this puts us in a situation where all these efforts are concurrent and happening and sometimes conflicting. And so it's still unclear, at least to me, how these things will lead to something actionable. And then the third actor that is by no, last but not least, is the general public, which is a remarkable, important actor in this decision making. Earlier in the AI panel, I believe Angie, who's a colleague of mine in CS, in computer science, she was saying how these explanations that we give of algorithms should be very important to the user. And that's true. The problem is that there is not a single user. One thing is to develop methods that are explainable, for example, for clinicians who have to face a patient and perhaps provide explanations. Or maybe it's the patient who is receiving recommendations directly from a chatbot online about whether they should see a primary care physician or not. Or maybe it's policymakers who perhaps care or think about these questions from a much broader public policy perspective as opposed to the individual patient that you have in front of you. So these are questions that I think a lot about. I see it, of course, on the technical front of this discussion, but I find it very interesting to try to understand how these different actors see these problems and try to come up with ways in which we can think about these problems analytically and hopefully give a solution. And lastly, I mentioned the topic of fairness, which is also something that I am increasingly interested about. And here again, you have this gap between how the academic world thinks and understands about what we can do to control for different levels of bias and different levels of fairness, and how the public understands what these matters are and what the issues in trust is, and how regulation puts forth their voice. For example, and we've had some discussions about this before, there's a number of regulations that sometimes prevent us, for example, from making decisions based on or using specific attributes. And of course, this is something that might be absolutely sensible in many situations. For example, with aspects like race or many other attributes that might be sensitive. Now, on the academic study of these problems, is absolutely well understood that just by not looking at these attributes means absolutely nothing about the extent to which you can be fair with respect to these attributes. And so, in fact, in the current year, we've had official voices and recommendations that allude to this kind of behavior. And there is a very active tension between people who study these things, who try to understand how methodology could be developed, what kind of problems are solvable, what kind of things you could actually hope to do, and the regulatory agencies who are closer perhaps to public opinion and to the interest of a much broader set of actors, including political actors. So there again, I find a lot of interest and fascination to try to understand all these constraints and coming up with formulas that can tell us hopefully how we can figure these things out a little bit better than we did before.
Thank you. Well, and I would argue that even there are gaps in understanding even among us academics, right? Especially in these intensely interdisciplinary spaces. We might even be using the same exact words, but we're meaning very, very different things, and we end up talking past each other oftentimes. So speaking of seeing from very different perspectives, we're now going to look at some of the same kinds of issues in biomedicine, but from the governance and ethics perspective, starting with Jeff Kahn. So you've, for years, been a leader in national and international conversations around ethics and governance of emerging technologies, including some of those mentioned here on the stage. Can you talk a bit about some of the challenges that you see at the international governance level? I mean, we had, there was talk of this in our wonderful opening session today of the challenges of international governance or harmonization, and even genome editing was mentioned as an example of that.
Sure, happy to. And I apologize for the hoarseness. I think one of the bugs that killed the aliens in War of the Worlds is in my larynx, but I'm getting over it. And I should say thanks for the invitation, and the organization has been a really interesting day. All of the panels, all the talks have been great. So kudos to Jim and Olga and the organizers. I am going to talk about responsible governance from an international perspective and the challenges as it relates to emerging life sciences technology, and the focus, just because that's where I have worked, as Deborah has said, on human genome editing applications. So as Deborah said, there's a distinction between the kinds of genome editing that Greg mentioned, where you're talking about a sick patient in front of you who you're treating and hopefully curing, but that genome change, that genetic modification, won't be passed on to their offspring, versus those that are heritable. And a lot of the ethics attention over the course of the development of human application of CRISPR-Cas9 and other genome editing technologies has been around when, if ever, would it be acceptable to use those technologies to modify individuals in a way that they would pass it on to the next generation. So you could modify their sperm or eggs, or you could modify an embryo such that all of the cells in that developing person would then be modified and passed on to the next generation. So I was a member of two international commissions grappling with that question and what to do about it. One before the JK announcement, so the announcement 5 years ago that Greg mentioned of the birth of at least one set of twins. We don't know whether there might have been more. One set of twins was announced after a commission that I served on that was convened by the National Academies just around the corner from here, the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, where we had articulated what we thought was a pretty clear and difficult set of criteria that would have to be met before such first-in-human clinical experiments could be undertaken. But it didn't stop Dr. He from doing what he did. So pointing to some real challenges in how we think about responsible governance of emerging life sciences technology. So I'm going to make 6 points. I promise 7, actually. It won't take as long as it sounds like it might. But more observations and then maybe some questions about how we at Hopkins might bring our diverse expertise to bear on trying to answer the issues here. So first, I think it's important to point out that modification of organisms at the genetic level is not new. We've been trying to do that for a really long time. It turns out that in the early days, there were very few labs that could do it. It took a lot of skill. It took very expensive laboratories, and it was really only a few places in the world that were able to use those technologies, let alone try to apply them. And so that meant it was much easier to control. So really the UK and the US labs in both of those places were the only places where recombinant DNA technologies could be brought to bear. And so there was an attempt by the profession, the people doing that science, to regulate themselves, to be responsible. A very famous event at the Asilomar Conference Center in California that led to a statement that was sort of pointed to as responsible science being carried out by the community itself. CRISPR-Cas9 is not like that, right? It's widely available, it's cheap. You can buy a kit on Amazon. High school science students are doing it in their labs in public schools. So the democratization of science is a good thing, but it means it's much more difficult to regulate. So that's point number 1. Point number 2, because of point number 1, the possibilities for self-policing kind of go away. So in the 1970s, when Asilomar happened, there was an attempt at self-policing. People might say it didn't work terribly well, but there certainly was an attempt. But now in the 21st century, it's really not possible. And I think after J.K. He, it became clear that it wouldn't happen, right? One individual can really kind of spoil the party for everybody. So that's point number 2. Point number 3, whatever we might think we're able to control by responsible governance in particular countries or even regions of the world, there will be technology tourism to places where there are less regulation or no regulation at all. And the example, sort of case in point as it relates to something that looks very much like human genome editing, is something called mitochondrial replacement, which is a reproductive technology which takes mitochondria from one woman, the nuclear DNA from a second woman, merges them together and fertilizes that with a sperm from one man, sometimes called 3-parent babies. It's outlawed in the United States, very tightly controlled in the UK, but before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, widely available in Kyiv. You get on an airplane, go to Kyiv, and you could get that done just for money. So the challenge of international governance of these emerging technologies is that people will go to find the application of those technologies that they want. So there will be tourism. Very difficult to prevent that, impossible, frankly. Fourth, the guidelines around the emergence of human genome applications over the course of many decades focused very heavily on risk and safety. So when we have gotten control of the risk and we think it's safe enough, then the ethics problems seem to kind of go away. It was kind of a safe place for the people who do ethics and science policy to focus. But it didn't take on the kind of core question of why is it wrong to modify somebody in a way that they will pass on that modification to future generations? We didn't really answer that question. And so as the technology advances, and you heard UK approved Vertex Technologies sickle cell gene therapy last week. It's clearly safe enough for the UK regulators, and it will be likely approved by the US FDA, as you said, next week. So if the risk is managed and it's safe enough, then what's left to worry about is sort of where we have, I think, led the people who pay attention to these issues. Number 5, the second commission that I served on was one that was convened after the announcement that Dr. He had performed human genome editing on embryos and 2 babies were born with the modification that Greg described. And that second committee tried very hard to articulate global principles by which human genome editing could be guided in its applications anywhere around the world. And we did, I think, a credible job at that, but principles are not the same as the criteria by which you would move forward with an emerging technology applied to humans, so not terribly useful. And second, principles and even criteria are not the same as governance, which is what we need. And governance happens at the state, the country level. I don't mean state like state of Maryland versus state of California. At the state level, national states make decisions about policy and governance. And so it's very hard to articulate even principles, or if they're articulated principles that everybody can agree to, the way they're applied can be different from country to country in a way that could affect any chance at harmonization. And I would say, even with the articulation of really clear principles, which is what the first committee report that I worked on did, Dr. Hay thought he had satisfied all of those criteria. That was his claim, actually. He didn't think he was doing something irresponsible. Frankly, he thought he was doing something responsible and following the criteria that had been articulated. So criteria without somebody to assess whether they have been met don't do much. And I think last is a question for us, which is what do we want the future of governance of emerging life sciences technologies to look like? And that's the work that we at Hopkins, with the science, the ethics, the policy, the international relations, the power that we can bring from across the very diverse university that we represent to bring together to try to answer that question and figure out how to do responsible science in a way that will serve everybody in a way that's equitable and accessible. I'll stop.
Great. Thank you so much. And now, Adler. So, you have your hands in lots of different projects at Hopkins, which, is not only makes sense because of your remit, but also because of your sort of intensely interdisciplinary background that you personally represent. So can you talk a bit about how you think about sort of bringing folks from different disciplines together to solve problems that are meaningful to communities?
Yes, but I have to start with an apology.
Oh.
Yeah, I shared the slides with you ahead of time, and I had them on my phone, so I was going to kind of scroll through them while we were talking, and my phone died. So I'm going to have to go a little rogue. I hope that's okay. Yeah, it's fine. It's fine. Yeah, we'll make it up. We'll see. Let's see what happens. So I'll start with a personal anecdote because it relates to technology and policy. And I actually shared this the last time I was on this stage in this very chair, so I'm not going to bang on about it too much. But so I started as an intelligence analyst in the military 24 years ago. And at the time, there was a policy called Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which meant that it was not illegal to be gay in the military. It was illegal to tell people you were gay or to ask people if they were gay. If it was a secret, that was okay, as long as it was your little secret. And so for me, as a military intelligence analyst with a top secret SAIS security clearance, that created a lot of cognitive dissonance in therapy. So basically, because of that policy, I left the military. And there were lots of other analysts and linguists and others who were similarly situated that because of that policy, they gave up their dream of being a warfighter to go do other things. So for me, I was lucky in that Lockheed Martin swooped in and gave me a big bag of cash to make my tears go away. But I think that really speaks to the power of policy on our not only technological capabilities, but really the level of inclusion and diversity of thought that we can have in a technical discipline. And so I'm gonna talk about two of my favorite classes to teach because that's easy for me to do. And I'm going to talk about 3 innovation programs we have at Hopkins that I think are related. So my first class that I'll mention is called, it's at the business school, it's called Business Leadership and Human Values. I love this class because I get to be, I say curious, my mom says nosy, so I get to get in my students' business. So I teach MBAs and Masters of Finance students, so they're very used to classes where there's a right answer, there's a wrong answer, you put it on the piece of paper, you give it to the professor, and I say, good job or bad job. For my class on the first day, I say, tell me your name, where you're from, and how your relationship with your mother shapes the way you navigate conflict at work. And don't write that down. We're going to talk about that as a group. Your peers are going to talk about that as a group, and we're going to work it out. Group therapy, free. Well, I mean, they pay tuition, but they don't pay for the therapy part. And it's a beautiful experience. I have a friend who I got to pick up my classes this semester, and she's really enjoying it too. But the students, I think, initially were very anxious and pensive. And then I remind them that 25% of their grade is class participation. And because there are a lot of finance folks, they appreciate that it's mathematically impossible to pass if they don't participate. So then they start to chime in a bit more. But I had a student the last time I taught, and I think it was week 7. And I try to check in with him each week to make sure no one's like crying in the corner or anything like that. And so he said, this class really helped me see that I always knew I had a moral compass, but now I know which direction it's pointing. And I think that is kind of the theme of the class, but that's something that I also have tried to take with me after my early experiences in the military, because I thought that was really a question of my values and what I stand for and what's important to me. And so I bring that to the work that I do now, and I think that's part of why my background and practice is so interdisciplinary. So I have 6 degrees, because I'm a nerd, and they're in pretty different spaces. And the good thing for me is that I get to bring all of that together in the work that I do. And so I'll talk about the second class. This is so easy because I'm just talking about myself. I hope that's okay. So the second class is Digital Health Innovation and Regulatory Science. So it's really about how to create culturally competent digital health technology. So not thinking about, can I make this shiny, expensive, cool thing, but really like, where is the need? Who do I want to serve, and what is actually going to be useful to them? And so kind of working with the students to take that patient-centered design perspective. And then because I went to law school, so they make me teach all these legal things. So we also go through what the FDA thinks about if it's software as a medical device, what the requirements are and the different regulatory pathways. And I like this class a lot too, because I think it teaches the innovators to think about who they want to serve. Not just what do they want to create, but who do they want to help, and what do those people need. And sometimes in academia, I think we don't always do that as well as we could, because we get so excited about the thing that we want to nerd out about, and I love to nerd out. If you want to talk about rocket science later, I would love to nerd out about that. But we don't really, we don't always think about who we want to serve and what they need. And so that's a lot of the programs that I want to talk about. Am I doing okay on time? Okay, I'm a talker like my dad. My dad's a talker. We can talk I could do the whole panel by myself just talking, so please stop me. So the first program is called HexSite. So it's a program at the medical school, and basically what we do is we have clinicians from across the health system. They pitch medical software ideas. We basically do kind of like a Shark Tank. I'm always the Paula judge. I'm never the Simon. I'm always like, oh, I love everything, which is not always so helpful, but that's how the cards get dealt. So they kind of share their ideas, and then we pair them with a business student, an engineering student, and a graphic designer. We train them for 16 weeks to basically develop a medical software startup. And it's lovely because the clinician is not in charge. They get to bring their medical software idea that they're super passionate about. We pair them with a business person who can help them think about the different challenges that business would need to think about. We pair them with a technologist who can help them think about how to actually operationalize their idea. And then we pair them with a marketing person who can make it pretty and make people want to actually buy it. And so this one's really good because it just gets the different stakeholders to put themselves in the other person's position. So the clinicians say a lot, I would have never thought about it this way. So for example, we had this company that was developing a technology for people with sleep apnea. So it wasn't to treat sleep apnea, it was to alert them that they should go in and be seen by an ENT or someone to diagnose that. And so they were pitching it to the person who was snoring. And so we said, well, they're asleep. Like they don't know and they don't care. Maybe they're partners who we need to pitch it to, right? So kind of thinking about like, what are you making and who actually needs it? And so so that program's been a lot of fun. But I think for that one, that really helped me see the idea that people kind of operate in silos. And especially in academia, it's very easy to get very specialized and really quite excellent at your specialty. And the thing that I love about being at Hopkins is we have so many people who are just on the panel alone who are much smarter than me that I get to talk to and ask for help. And so that's been a great experience. We have another program Nitish and I are both on, called Neurotech Harbor. And so that's a $120 million grant from the NIH. And the focus is on doing calls for proposals several times a year, where we ask people around the country, and actually even internationally people can apply, to share their neurotechnology ideas. But when we pitched it to the NIH, we said diversity is really important to us, and we actually look at it in 3 ways. So one is, of course, the table stakes version of that. Who is doing the innovating? Of course, we want to be more inclusive in that way. But then we also think about who's represented as an expert or leader in that space, because there are plenty of women, plenty of people from underrepresented groups that don't always get a platform to kind of demonstrate their expertise. And so when we look at our leadership team and our consultants who we bring on to help the teams, we're very thoughtful about that. And then the third way is, who are we trying to help? And again, for me, that has been so important to keep in mind, is who are we trying to help and what do they actually need? Not what do I want to give to them, but what do they need? And so, you know, at Hopkins, we're very good at making shiny, expensive things. There's no shame in that. But there are a lot of disease states that don't get a lot of attention because there aren't always shiny, expensive things you can make. Or maybe they're disease states that have a lot of stigma, like substance use disorder and a variety of other conditions. And so that's been a real source of pride for me, and I think for the broader team, this idea that we get to work on such an impactful grant and do it in a way that we feel we can help a lot of people. And then the third program is called Chesapeake Digital Health Exchange. Oh, I'm getting close. Okay. We'll talk about that later. How about that? Okay.
Great, thank you so much. So we did get started here a little bit late. So we've talked about lots of different technologies, different aspects of the innovation ecosystem. And I want to take us back actually to a question that Mark Drudzy asked with the AI panel, a point that he made, that it's not a natural progression, these emerging technologies. Like, he was talking about ChatGPT, but it's true of all of these rapidly evolving technologies, right? There's not a preordained way that these are going to go. It's about human choices, right? So the question he said was, or what he said was, that the next step or model will be determined by what the people in the room wanted to do, right? And which takes us back to the question that Nitish raised about what do we want to invest in, and what you just said, Adler, about who do we want to help, right? So who needs to be part of the discussions? Who needs to be in those rooms so that these technologies are developed in ways that maximize both individual and community level benefit and minimize harms? Who wants to start?
I'm going to say something controversial. Well, maybe not super controversial, but I was on a panel about AI bias and fairness, and there was a lot of talk about the role of technology. And what I pointed out to them is actually the bias oftentimes gets into the system by people who are biased. So what are we doing about the biased people who put that information into the system? And so then maybe the system does some other things, AI, ML, whatever the tech is, which, you know, I love tech, but, and then that's often given to a human who's biased, who adds more bias on top of it. So I think it's important to think about the tech stack. That's certainly important, but I think we also have to think about the type of society we're creating and the embedded bias and how we're addressing that, because we can make the best technology solutions in the world, but if the users and contributors to that technology don't have a strong gauge on their moral compass, then you're not going to really solve the issue.
Or if it's only available at a certain price or in certain hospitals. And we live in a country, of course, that doesn't have universal health care or a right to health care. Yeah, Nitish.
Yeah, so I raised that question, right? Would you rather have $100 million brain control prosthesis with surgery, etc.? Or would you rather have a startup that produces FDA-approved, affordable prosthesis for Americans? Or would you rather develop a device that is applicable around the world, 3D printed, soft prosthesis that any kid can wear if they lose a limb on accident, right? And we have choices to make, right? So I'll be controversial, since you used the word an elitist, that the option 3 is valid. I mean, it will do the greatest good, I think, which is affordable artificial limb to anyone everywhere in the world. I would contend the controversy is this. Most institution and US and elsewhere can solve that problem. So therefore, why us? The mid-level is where Ethos of Hopkins is going, which is improving entrepreneurship and all of that, and we spin off companies, and economic engine of Maryland improves, and so on and so forth. I would say everyone can do that too. We should too. So my elitist answer, which is why I said controversial, is that we should do only we can do. It's paradigm shift that initially doesn't seem like helps everyone, and it's not cost effective. And as progression occurs, that's why I brought up the case of defibrillator. First dean of engineering, very famous cardiologist, made it happen. That was as ridiculously like resuscitate somebody who was otherwise dead. And now we have a defibrillator every floor in this building. So we made a profound impact by being elitist. And I meant elitist in a intellectually invigorating, creative, research-centric, and then let things fall from there. And so all 3 examples are valid, but I think we should be doing the most impactful paradigm-shifting work and invest resources on that. And that is mainly to provoke all of you, that statement.
Jeff?
I'm happy to, it'll be a little bit of a different take. And I don't think Darren will be controversial what I'm going to say. But I think the answer to your question, Deborah, is, really dictated by the paradigm that we have in place for bringing things to market, right? So the Vertex sickle cell gene therapy has a price tag predicted in the US of something like $3 million per patient. So what gets researched and then brought to market are the things that can both work, obviously, but also have sufficient payout, and that's the system that we have. So that's a big challenge to confront because it butts right up against Nitish's point, right? Does it do the greatest good for the greatest number of people? That doesn't seem to be what's in the consideration, or at least among the things in consideration. So that's the sort of objective answer to your question. The normative answer to your question is different. Like, how do we change things so that these amazing immunotherapies that are coming and gene therapies that are coming can be more widely available to the people who can not just benefit, but their lives could be saved and changed as a result. The problem is the cost to benefit ratios going the wrong to equity, right? Combinations going the wrong way, right? Getting much more expensive because they're kind of bespoke therapies, more or less. Anyway, so that's to me, we can spend an entire day or week or month, whatever you want, just on how to fix this problem. But that's a big nut to crack, I think, in all of this. And the emerging technologies only are at the front end of that lead to the kinds of therapies that Mark was describing. Sorry, that Greg was describing.
I loved hearing what Nitish was saying about the defibrillator example and how that works, and your statement that perhaps to go for what we can most impactfully do ourselves, even if it's not for the greatest, serving the greatest number of people, is thought-provoking, and there's some merit to doing that. But I wonder, initially, right? But and then
we invest millions and billions,
right?
But then it's been soft.
Right. Right, and then you said after that then let the technology and outcomes fall where they may. And I'm just curious what that falling where they may process looks like and what it actually took to get a defibrillator on every floor, because I expect there was a lot of policy decisions and governance that went into that. And so just to answer that question about who...
me here, that's what SAIS can play a role, right?
yeah.
Because that was not technology limitation, it's the policies and governance and ethics and even entrepreneurship that rest of you bring. And that's why this is such a beautiful panel and what we're discussing.
Right, right. So just to answer who has to be in the room, I think it's the people that are going to benefit, the scientists and technologists that can help that happen, and then the policymakers and lawmakers that can also, are necessary to make that happen and allow that to happen.
If I can just complement with one thing, I think I agree to a large extent with everything that has been said. But to your question of, who, kind of like by definition, emerging technologies are brought about by people who don't necessarily think at large or by the needs of the community at large. They're brought about by people who are playing in their laboratories. The same thing happened with the steam engine. The same happened with the newspaper at some point. And so you have these breakthroughs in technology that come about from pure sort of, and to some extent, sort of intellectual pursuit. Nerding out, exactly. And then the question becomes, okay, how is society going to respond so that these tools benefit the broader community? And how that plays out, I think, heavily depends on, I don't know how it should be played out, but my impression is that the way that plays out depends on who are the main actors involved and what their motivations are. So you were very well saying that, in these CRISPR technologies, there is a very clear price tag on these tools becoming available. In the AI side, a lot of these tools are housed in a very reduced number of private companies that have their own interests. And there's a very big gap between those stakeholders and the rest of the public. And I would argue that gap has to be filled by education, basically, by being able to communicate in a very clear, transparent way to the public, who eventually will make decisions through the democratic process as to how these tools should be regulated, put in place, leveraged on, and harnessed, really. But without that component of having the general public understanding what these tools are, what they can do, what they cannot do, it's very hard to come up with regulations and norms that the entire people can agree with to a large extent.
So we will turn to questions from the audience. I should have primed you for that before I asked this question, so we had a line, but it looks like we actually already have a question ready to go. So he was up first. Sorry, Jim.
Hello, great day. I have a particular interest in policy in research and development funding from the government and how that further develops great new inventions, products, and services for the American public and the world at large. There's a particular issue which has to do with funding of new innovations, say, for example, modified RNA technology, which was funded by the U.S. government maybe 20 years ago, with the idea then it was basic research. Ultimately, it led to products that are very valuable, very helpful for the American society and the world at large, vaccine for COVID. But this was funded by the U.S. government many years ago. There is oftentimes talk, and I'd like to get a better feedback from y'all, especially in the biology sciences and applied biology sciences that deal with economic development. How should the federal government look at funding, not as money it gives for a good cause, but as an investment for future products that American society can use, and how there should be a feedback on how well that kind of funding is done? As, for example, should the funding specifically tie to products that are developed in the future there should be a way of getting a discount back to the government for having that funding that helped develop, say, this modified RNA vaccine. How would you look at that specifically, and how could it be done?
Anyone want to take that on? How do we create a more of an investment model, right, wherein the government earns something back, right, based on the investments they put in at the basic level, right? Because basic research is basic until the moment it isn't.
Let me just make a comment. I'm not going to try to answer that question, but let me make a comment that perhaps can allude to it. And I'm going to wear my foreigner hat right now. So I've only been in this country for a little bit over 5 years. I'm originally from Argentina. And one of the things that I'm fascinated by, increasingly so as time passes, is how certain countries, and in particular the United States, sees basic research as being a fundamental component of the well-being and the progress of society. And maybe what you're saying is true. I might be completely wrong. But my impression is that the government does not see the investment in fundamental basic research as giving money away to benevolence. I think from, again, my short time being here, the investment in basic research is very intentional. And I think the United States has this track record of showing how much it pays off. For example, I'm sort of close to the community of computational harmonic analysis and applied mathematics, and there, David Donahoe, who's a very extremely well-regarded mathematician from Stanford, he actually gave a presentation a couple of blocks away from here, I believe, a couple of years ago, where he demonstrated, or rather told a story of how these ideas of compressed sensing, which are basically a math problem of how can we measure information and understand, transmit information while making the fewest number of measurements of a phenomenon. That was the United States very heavily invested in that problem as a pure mathematical concept, but that led to developing a completely new generation of MRI machines and a completely new generation of sensors and transmitters. And that perhaps it did not benefit the United States government directly by charging all these services, but I think they have benefited the community at large. It's grown the economic powerhouse of the country and of the world to some extent. So I'm kind of impressed by the opposite, in some sense, of what you were referring. I think there's this understanding that the investment of public research, of fundamental basic research is fundamental to advancing society.
So I have been encouraged by some of the funding mechanisms that I've seen come out of the NSF. So one is around encouraging STEM education. And so I'm working with a team to put together a proposal to train young girls in Baltimore to do video game development in virtual reality. And we're actually teaching them algebra and physics, but it's under the auspices of learning how to make a video game. And I think in some ways, culturally, we have this idea of like a Steve Jobs person coming with this grand emerging technology that's going to revolutionize society. But in fact, there are lots of people who have ideas. They just don't have access to capital or access to infrastructure or a lot of the other things that you need to be a successful innovator. So I think the government funding STEM at a young age is really important. And then equally, some of the girls that we work with, their parents come in and there are areas in Baltimore where the average household income is like $10,000 a year. And so they're coming from households where their parents could probably benefit from workforce development in a STEM field. And so we're looking at grants in that space as well. But I think part of it is getting outside of this traditional lens of who can create emerging technology, maybe even broadening the lens of what technology looks like. So it does feel like the government now is funding more, but I also think that we, as a culture, have to, or we get to, evolve our idea of who can be involved and what that looks like and what they need and how we can support that.
Well, and what questions can be asked and answered with these kinds of technologies? Yep. Jeff, did you want to weigh in, or should I turn to? No.
So I want to push you on the international governance side a bit more on this. You gave a pretty bleak account for good reasons about the challenges and limitations here. And this one may be mostly for Greg and Deborah and Jeff. But I want to ask you to reflect on one particular case, which is gain of function research. I mean, we've had a lot of concerns, right? We had the whole Wuhan lab thing. But I mean, here's a situation where there are clearly important biomedical potential gains from this kind of thing, but we're all probably painfully aware of the risks. Do you see this as a potential area where there might be a possibility of actually getting meaningful agreement about principles and implementation, which you correctly, Jeff, pointed out is as much of a problem here? And what would it take, or what would it look like to actually have something which has this kind of, twin-edged gain and horrible danger to be something the international community could deal with?
Jeff, do you want to?
I'm happy to start. Yeah, that's a good example. So just say two more words about the work that I was involved in. So one of the committees was here in Washington. The other was convened by the Royal Society in the UK and the National Academies here. That was the internationally focused one, and we spent a lot of time talking about what kinds of mechanisms might there be for international agreement. And when you start to pay attention to that, you know this world better than I do, Jim. But we have international treaties for very few things. And so it's hard to imagine creating an international treaty over, whether we're going to modify human embryos. It just doesn't seem like that's going to get traction. Maybe for something like gain of function research, that does fall into more like bioweapons. And, we seem to have behaved pretty well as a global community around smallpox, for instance. So that does, for me, give me a sense of hope that we could probably make some headway around gain of function in a way that we probably can't for things like, embryo modification. That said, the world seems to be kind of falling apart that way, in a way that makes that not so likely at the moment. But of course, that will hopefully change too.
Well, and I'll go back to something that was said during the fireside chat this morning about what makes it possible for NIST to do some of the work it does. It's relationships, right? And dialogue, and having these conversations between scientists and folks who think about governance and biosecurity in the same room, building rapport so that when something happens somewhere, someone else gets a call, right? Because we're not going to be able to, like, here's the set of rules, everyone implement them the same way, because we all have different governance structures. We don't even have the same, ways of operating, right? So that kind of thing will never work. But if we can establish enough trust that we at least learn when things go off the rails, I mean, that's at least a starting point.
On that, as Adler and I said 2 weeks ago, the Neurotech Harbor, the program that NIH funded us, had same kind of panel sitting here discussing NIH, others research, but there were a foundation representative who says they are behind disease-specific solution. And the most eloquent were consumer, the user, human advocate, that's what is needed. So it's need-based research, epilepsy, let's say, that was the panel that I chaired. And I think that created a wonderful message that technology, along with, if in the room where NIH and FDA staff, they said they are going to promote safe and effective therapies, but foundations bringing to the attention what people and consumer need, right? So I think that's how things can be tied together. And I believe our harbor got funded because we paid attention to that, along with what Adler mentioned about diversity and equity, right? So that it is not that lonesome disease is left behind. and the cost effectiveness was also managed. So I think in that one example, we're trying to pull it together. It's just a piece of this gigantic technology world and biology world, so I can't answer to everybody else.
So the trust that resonated with me, this idea of trust, I think that's important. It makes me think about the first organization I worked for. The motto was, "In God we trust, all others we monitor." And so it's this sense that, because basically as an analyst, I was specifically using a variety of techniques to monitor global nuclear treaty compliance. And so there are a lot of international frameworks there because there's a sense of urgency there. And there's also a way to monitor activity. They're agreed upon norms. And so I think that's part of it too. The trust is important, but also enforcement is important as well. And so I think that's going to be necessary for this space too.
Yeah, but the tricky bit with synthetic biology and gain of function research is that they don't have the footprint that nuclear has, right? That's always been the problem. You can, I mean, it was mentioned earlier today, you can go on eBay, you can buy the synthesizer, you can make it in your garage. That's not monitorable at a certain level, right? So we need to find other mechanisms to capture stuff.
To me, too, I mean, more to your point, Jim, the scientific community wants to do the right thing. They don't want to be irresponsible. So what are we governing against, right? Is it the homebrew person, working in their basement, or is it the rogue actor, or is it the evil access of a bad acting state? Like, what is it that we're trying to prevent? I think helps us answer that question a little bit. So, we all were reacting to J.K. and the birth of twins, which, seemed irresponsible and bad, but it's bad in a different way than unleashing gain-of-function research in a way that could eradicate, the human race.
Yep. Over here.
Hi, everyone. Is this on? Yes. Okay. Yep. I just had a question about we're talking about who you want in the room for these conversations, and I feel like we have a lot of instances where those people are all in the room together, but we don't necessarily get a lot of progress from those conversations. And so I wanted to ask you, as the scientists and the ethicists who would be in that room, like, what do you need from the policymakers, from the lawmakers, to walk away from those conversations and feel like, okay, we actually made progress today. Like, I feel like we got something out of this, because I'm someone who's trying to sort of enter into that space, and I want to be someone who can actually, make something happen in theory. And so I just want to hear from you what you sort of see missing, what you wish those actors could do for you in those conversations.
Anyone want to start?
Jeff, you mentioned that you had written up many guidelines that weren't turned into law, and I don't know what the process looks like. How could you turn those guidelines into law? Could you walk away from a meeting like that with lawmakers and have start a vote?
Well, I mean, many of the things I've been involved with, they have been handed to, government policymakers. Sometimes they adopt them, rarely actually, I should say sometimes. Once in a while they adopt them as you recommend. Sometimes they sort of go all whole hog and say, we're not going to let this happen at all. A total prohibition, which is sort of not what you want the answer to be. And other times they ignore them altogether. So it's a sort of hit or miss answer. I think in the case of the human genome editing example, there was a readiness on the part of the NIH to adopt the principles that came and the criteria that came from that report. But then there was a bad actor that made it impossible for anybody to go forward in any responsible way, it seemed. So, one of the things the scientific community rightly worries about, when one bad actor does something, it stops the process of that science from going forward, which is in a way a kind of good a braking mechanism, right? You don't want rogues because they screwed up for everybody else. But there's no real way to govern, right, make policy against rogue behavior. So that to me is a big challenge in all of this.
Well, and if I may, I'd say that, if the receptor, the person who wants the policy, who can act on the policy, is in the room, you've already won a huge battle, right? Because it's often not it's not one report or one consensus study, one, guideline or recommendation document that's going to change the world, but the accumulation of a weight of similar documents pointing in the same direction. And then something like the twins happen, and that is ready to actually take action on, right? So, I did a project once long ago trying to look at the impact of the ethical, legal, and social implications program of the Human Genome Project on policy, right? And you don't look at, there's not like one thing necessarily that you can look at, right? It's this community that was created, the fact that there are now ethics people in many, if not most of those rooms, right? You can't point to one thing, but it's a shift that happens. Anyone else want to add?
I could talk about this stuff all day, but
Yeah,
we
no,
have
me too.
other people at the microphone.
Good afternoon, good evening at this point. I'd like to go back to the to Greg, or this question is more or less addressed to Greg. With respect to CRISPR, you brought CRISPR up early in the conversation, and if one would combine one of the former panels on artificial intelligence with CRISPR, meaning that several iterations, millions of iterations with algorithms with respect to CRISPR. And let's say, as Walter Isaacson said in his book, The Code Breaker, that I want to be strong, or I want to be more intelligent. Where is that aspect of, hey, if I wanted to have an IQ of 165, or if I wanted to be Arnold Schwarzenegger, where is that aspect of conduct where we say enough is enough, or you can't go there, or maybe we all go there and we all are strong and we all are smart and we don't have the health infirmaries that most of us do have?
Yeah, so I guess you're asking, what could the process look like if society decided we all wanted to go the whole hog and give ourselves everything, full human engineering?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that right now the rules are wisely founded against making CRISPR babies because we don't have a full sense of what the off-target effects are of those. So certainly we would need to be far enough along that we felt confident that we're not going to give half of the people cancer when we engineer them to be superhuman individuals. I think, in addition to that, understanding all of the genetic diversity that encompasses human variation, and we need a lot more research to even understand that, because we don't know between individuals from different continents what are the genes and variants that are changing their just their height, for example, and so. Understanding that, I think, will also be important, because if you try to employ something like that and do it broadly based on our study of people in one continent, then it's going to have a very different impact on another person. So there's a whole lot of basic science that still needs to be worked out before you could consider that. But I do think that with the rate that we're progressing, that could very well be a choice that has to be made in the next decades, certainly within 100 years.
Although I think it's safe to say that we will never all have access. That is just not the kind of world we live in. But any...
I would just, to add what you just said, Greg, the ethics argument has been, if the benefit isn't sufficient to outweigh the risk, then we shouldn't go forward. And so the way you just articulated, I think, was it's maybe not a good enough reason or a high enough benefit to try to enhance somebody versus curing a disease. So the bar, in a way, is lower for sickle cell than it is for making you Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Absolutely, thank you.
I think Arnold Schwarzenegger gets to end the day. So this is not actually the last session, this is the penultimate session, but please join me in thanking our panelists. And now I think we turn it back to Olga.
Is this working? Good. My name is Ed Schlesinger. I'm the Benjamin T. Rome Dean of the Whiting School of Engineering, and the organizers asked me to say a few words just to sum up this entire day in just a few sentences. So no problem. I will try to convey a few thoughts that hopefully tie a few things together. First of all, let me say it is a pleasure to be here today. This beautiful new facility. I think this provides Johns Hopkins with a tremendous opportunity to have an impactful presence in Washington, D.C., to interact with policymakers, and to influence matters of policy in general, and technical policies in particular. The newly announced School of Government and Policy, coupled with the School of Advanced International Studies, will truly allow Johns Hopkins to address the full spectrum of policy matters, both nationally and internationally. And this, combined with our broad expertise across technology and the also recently announced monumental investment in artificial intelligence and data science, will further enhance our capabilities to address issues of policy and technology. But the challenges we face today are truly as old as technology itself. Even with the development of stone tools and the harnessing of fire, technology has always been and continues to be a two-edged sword. If you notice that itself is a technology-based idiom. Technology permits people to undertake good, it permits people to undertake ill. It allows us to wage war or to improve the human condition. Today, even more so, I would note that nothing that humans do, and I emphasize nothing because I cannot think of a counterexample, nothing that humans do has not in some way been enabled, modified, includes the use of, or touched by technology. All we do, all our actions are intimately intertwined with technological systems, whether that's in the domains that are obvious, such as communications, transportation, or energy production, or those that even a few years ago didn't seem to involve technology, such as reproduction, social bonding, food preparation, or even the creation of art and entertainment. Technology is all pervasive, and more of it is of increasing complexity. And because of this reality, because of the complexity of technology and the complexity of its interaction with and integration with human activity, the need to have a deeper understanding of both technology and policy is paramount if we are to pursue policies that make sense and have the desired social effect. We need to educate policymakers to understand technological innovations, and we need to educate technologists as to how technology modifies and affects human activity. All this while technological advancement and change accelerate at a pace that evades our comprehension. To offer just one example of how quickly things change and how quickly change happens, I believe that everyone in this room, whether you're 30 or whether you're 60, could not imagine the technology we have today when you were 5 or 10 years old. The iPhone was introduced on June 29th, 2007. That was 16 years ago. That means that if you are older than 16 years old, your experience of childhood and technology is very different from students currently in high school who grew up with iPhones. The permeation, pace, and impact of technology has expanded. One manifestation of this impact is that technology has put into the hands of individuals what was once reserved for institutions. And this has many implications. When Gutenberg developed movable type, we had the ability to move individual letters instead of creating entire pages of words at a time. The cost of printing was reduced, efficiency improved tremendously. It meant that books could be made more widely available to a broader audience, not just to the lords of the manor or the church or those who held affluent positions in society. It increased the use of the vernacular, caused pages to be numbered. Authorship suddenly mattered. Reading became a silent activity. Literacy rates increased. It also allowed for the start of revolutions through the dissemination of information. It took the monopoly of books away from institutions and gave them to individuals. And by giving control of information to individuals, the roles of institutions was in some way diminished. Publishing today happens and is undertaken by individuals and small groups, and so in many ways has diminished the role of publishers. Information is ubiquitous. The roles of libraries has changed. Medical and health monitoring and measurement now happens outside of hospitals, and more. On the other hand, institutions are still needed, but their role has dramatically changed. Publishers are not needed as much to produce printed copies or to distribute information, but they are needed to curate, review, and offer some confidence in the quality of the information being published. The automobile allows us to go anywhere we want to. It offers individual travel, autonomy, and mobility, unlike trains, which takes us only where they want to go and on the schedule they want to get there. But we need roads, navigation systems, communication about where the roads lead and their condition. In short, we need institutions to provide the infrastructure that supports the use of the automobile, that defines the rules of the road, that optimize automobile performance and constrain its use. So even as technologies empower individuals, the institutional infrastructure to support those technologies, to allow them to do what we want and need them to do, is necessary. This is perhaps a realization that dawned on dictators recently, and that's why they control and want to control infrastructure to such a great extent. So where does this leave us? Technology has always been a tool that enhances or degrades the human experience. Today, it permeates everything, changes faster than ever before, and it's becoming more complex. Technology is also changing the relationship between individuals and institutions, both empowering individuals but requiring institutional infrastructure. And so, we need to develop experts in both technology and policy to develop thoughtful policies that work for the benefit of our society and our values. And this is needed more than ever before. And I believe that Johns Hopkins is particularly well positioned, given its physical locations, its expertise, its scale, to address technology and policy, I think, and I'm biased, better than any other institution. And so I look forward to our discussion in this space continuing to develop, to seeing us all have a real impact on government and our society through policy and technology. So thank you for that, but before we depart, I want to also thank all the organizers who spent a significant amount of time getting this event off the ground. So in no particular order, from SAIS, Jim Steinberg for hosting us, Melissa Griffith, Olga Belagolova, Henry Farrell, Chris Crosby, Mark Bailey. From Whiting, Adler Archer, Mark Dresdy, Mitra Taheri. From APL, Jason Collerai, Bobby Brown, Patrick Binning, Veronica Koch, Kristen Vinard, and Carol Lapointe. And from Berman, Deborah Matthews and Jeffrey Kahn. I'd also like to thank all of their speakers, student volunteers, events and communications teams, and facilities staff who made today such a success. And finally, I also want to take a moment to thank our two keynote speakers who kicked off the day for us, Lori Locascio, Director of National Institutes of Standards and Technology, and Jason Matheny, President and Chief Executive Officer of RAND. I do hope that everyone enjoyed today's event. As I say, I look forward to seeing the impact of our collective efforts, and I want to thank you all, and I believe there's a reception to which you are all invited. Thank you.